Hello and welcome to the podcast called The Pharmacist. I am the farmerette assisting crops on your farm and digging into agriculture. And to all of the farmers out there, I am going to kind of dig into nutrients a little bit more, and I'm not going to start with nitrogen. You're probably thinking that's where I'm going to start because that's what a lot of guys do. I am not. I am going to start with potash. I am going to start with potassium. And I want to dig into this nutrient because it is so critical. Even though we rank it as number 3, it is so important in your corn crop, especially for nitrogen. So I want to dig into that. So if you're not into farming and you're not into growing corn, or maybe you just grow plants in general, maybe you got some sweet corn, please pay attention to this podcast and let's dig into potassium. Potassium, potash. This is a nutrient that I am noticing is not getting the attention that it deserves, because your corn and soybeans will pull a lot of potash out of the soil bank, I call it. And yes, we're replenishing it, and we think we're probably putting enough out there, but are we? So don't shortchange your crops on potash, or you will fool no one but yourself. You can't expect to have plump, full grain to hold a stand. That, potash has so much to do with your stand of corn, or to have your crops make full use of other nutrients that they get from the soil. If that plant's starving on diets of potash. More than any other nutrient, potassium is the hammer and the trowel in building of the plant, period. It is the regulator. It's the catalyst. It introduces elements to each other in that plant, in that corn factory, so that they can form compounds and be carried from one part of the plant to the other. I call it's the transporter. It transports everything. So plants need potassium before they can even build chlorophyll. And we know what chlorophyll does. It makes your plants green. And that's your whole photosynthesis factory. But plants need potassium before they can build chlorophyll. Did you just hear me say that? Which they must have to use the free nutrients from the air, the carbon, the hydrogen, the oxygen. Those are also nutrients. Don't forget those. But these free nutrients, I call them as a producer, these are free, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, make up more than 90% of the weight of the plants. And plants can't make starches. They can't make sugars. They can't make proteins. They can't make vitamins, enzymes, or cellulose without potassium. Talk about having to have this for your crop factory. And I like to talk as a plant as a factory, and you grow billions of them. I've said this before. Plants that have enough potassium will use less water, especially during a drought. Plants that have plenty of potassium available to them will make better use of nitrogen. That I have seen the last 30 years. Potassium is needed to balance the effects of nitrogen, and to some extent phosphorus in that plant. Potassium is also needed by plants to make that stiff straw, that stalk, which helps resist lodging and diseases. That's another thing that guys notice is like your stalks, your corn standing better when you harvest because you've got potassium in there. If you're seeing that your stalks are having some diseases or stalk issues, take a look at your potassium on your soil test, and also look at the base saturation portion. It's usually over to the right side, and look at and see what your magnesium and your potassium levels are at on that percentage. You can look at it as ratios, you can look at it as percentage. I just want to make sure that you're tuning in with the magnesium, because that is where the tie-up happens, and we want to get potassium into the crop. The potassium is needed by plants before they can transport those starches, the sugars, and all the energy foods from those leaves where they are made down to the roots and other parts of the plant where they're used. So short ratios of potassium mean that your grain is going to be shrunken and that plant can't make the starch needed to build those plump kernels. And short rations of potassium mean that, like in the fall, you can't make sugars and starches. And that's the biggest thing. And that's why we grow corn. We want the grain. That is the main goal of the plant, is to reproduce any plant. And it's got to go into those starches and sugars. It's all photosynthesis, and potassium is a huge component of that. If you have corn that's starved for potassium, it gets plugged with iron at those nodes of the plant, and the starches and sugars can't move from the leaves to the roots, and the roots starve. And roots and stalk rots, that's what's happening. Your roots and your stalk rots, riddle the plant, and the corn lodges. And other things like crops, if they're starving for potash, often they show sign in their leaves, their ears, the grain, the stalks. And, by the time you've seen it, it's too late. You've already affected yield. But remember, before your crop factories can use available potash, they have to find it in the soil. Although, potash is soluble in water, very little will come to the roots. The roots have to hunt for it in the soil. That means that the plants with these small root systems, like these seedlings, they got to have plenty of potash nearby. And plants, if they have a big appetite for potash, like potatoes, sugar beets, tobacco, are not able to get all that potash because that they need from the soil, even with that particular soil is high in potash, because they have a small root system. So we are lucky, fortunate with corn that we have a root system that likes to just sprawl. So I know I'm talking a little bit more specifically on corn, but obviously potassium is very important in soybeans also, because you need to have potassium for that seed set. I mean, the seeds it's the kernels or the pods, the beans, and you don't want low test weight, and you don't want small beans. So a lot of those sugar starches go into the fruit, which is the seed, which is what we're combining. And potassium, another thing I want to just call out is that soils that have high levels of magnesium are going to need higher levels of potassium, because those two like to fight in the soil. They like to both hold on to everything. And so remember that, because when we've had, if you have had some high yielding corn or beans, they are going to pull a lot of potassium out of the soil. And we all are doing our job of putting out potassium in the fall, but I've seen in the past where guys cut back, and I would recommend not doing that. And I will show you a PDF, I will link it below, of a situation that there was 130 pounds of actual potassium not put out in 2019. And the yield maps are haunting to this day. I don't know if it's potassium or phosphorus. I'm guessing it's potassium, because potassium has a lot of effect on other nutrients. And it has haunted beans, corn, every year. If you've ever, and this was because it was drowned out, that's why we didn't put it out there, but if you've ever reduced your potassium, and I know there's been years that we cut costs and we do it, don't do it. And if you think you've got enough parts per million on your soil test, to me, that's one thing. But like I said, your root's got to find it. It's got to be in solution. Is magnesium holding on to it? What's your base saturation percentage? Is it 4%, 7%, 1.5%? My opinion is you want it around 4 if you can get it there. If it's less than 2, that they're positive charge. This is the FARMacy School lesson of the day. Soil is a lot of chemistry. Potassium, it's on the elemental chart. That's why I call myself the pharmacist. That's why I have this FARMacy School for you. That's why I'm digging into potassium, to make you aware that you cannot ignore it. And don't blame anybody else if you've got stalk issues. Get a soil test and figure out what your soil levels are of potassium. But not only stalk, which is kind of where we go right away, but plants need potassium before they can build chlorophyll. And the key takeaway is that potassium is needed to balance the effects of nitrogen, period. Plants have to have plenty of potassium available for them to make better use of nitrogen. Remember that. Those are kind of my key takeaways on potassium, but it's very, very important in that whole factory of your plant. I don't care what you're growing, make sure your potassium levels are where they need to be at. Talk to your local agronomist if you have one, talk to them and make sure that your potassium is in line in your soil. That is my lesson of the day. I hope you enjoyed my podcast. I am the pharmacist assisting crops on your farm. My nickname is the Farmerette. You can follow me on social media under the Farmerette. And thank you for listening. I'm gonna hit some other things. I might go into just crop production of like dry beans or pistachio nuts or something. I don't know. I'm gonna mix it up a little bit. I know we're getting into spring, but I just want to dig into agriculture. Hopefully you're enjoying my podcasts, and we'll talk to you in the next episode.